Hello and welcome. My name's Michael Nelson, Customer Experience Manager with LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance. Today we're going to be exploring the functionality of the RegCompliance Plus platform and ways that you can use the data within your LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance subscription, the obligations and the alerts, to best effect to manage your organization's risk and compliance obligations. We've started with the landing page, and as you can see, we have access here to the 4 key elements of what the platform provides: obligations, alerts, search functionality, and the Protégé generative AI solution that supports this. We'll start with obligations. As you're no doubt aware, a wide variety of organizations across Australia have an extraordinarily wide variety of different legal and compliance obligations. The obligation registers that LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance Plus provides looks at those obligations through a variety of different lenses. But what they do provide you with is both broad coverage around particular areas of law, such as what we see on the screen here, privacy and data protection, but also obligations that look at what your organization needs to do when your organization engages in a particular activity or operates in a particular area. By that, I mean, if you have an Australian Financial Services license, there's an AFSL module for you. If you are a charity, there's a charities module for you. The obligations are designed to support and augment your understanding of what your organization needs to do in order to be compliant. A key feature of the platform that we're looking at the moment is not only the provision of the data around what those obligations look like through the obligations register, but also the capacity to shape and filter and flow that information so that the right people get the right information at the right time. What we're going to do today is look at the obligations and how you can begin to use those for your particular organization. Then we'll look at the alerts and how you can filter and flow the regulatory compliance that informs those obligations. We'll show you how to search to surface particular elements. And then finally, we'll look at the generative AI solution where you can bring all of that content to life. The default solution when you start with the obligations is the register view. And what this provides you with access to is all of the obligations in your subscription. Now, when I talk about modules, these are particular areas of law. So privacy and data protection, for example, is a module. Every module contains an overview obligation that looks at the kind of information that is caught in the rest of the module, so that when you're first coming to grips with content, the overview obligation is a great place to start to see what is in scope and what might be out of scope for the balance of the module. From there, we have what we call core and sub-obligations. Now, the default view is a core obligation, but to see all of the sub-obligations, go up to the top right and click Expand All, and that shows you the sub-obligations within each core obligation. Now, the difference is that a core obligation looks at a topic at a headline level and gives you the key things that you need to know in terms of what compliance looks like, what kind of operational controls you might need to consider, and what the risks are in the event that you've found to be in breach of this obligation. What the sub-obligations do is pick up each of those headlines and expand on those in focused but much more detail. So it allows you to weight the obligations that you've identified as relevant against the resources that you've got to manage and maintain those obligations. So we'll start with collecting personal and sensitive information. Now, because this is a core obligation, the first thing you'll see are links to the related sub-obligations. So if you land here and decide you just want to look at methods of collection, for example, you can go straight to that particular aspect. On the left-hand side, there are page anchors that will allow you to navigate within the obligation. On the right-hand side, there are navigation tools that show you where you are, which module, which jurisdictions this obligation is relevant to, when it was most recently updated, whether it's active or whether it's been archived, therefore redundant, but nonetheless within the system to allow you to revert back to pre-existing obligations in the event that you've got reporting obligations that span the transition between different regimes. And it shows you who's been assigned management of this obligation, its compliance status, the risk impact and likelihood, when it was most recently reviewed, and what control actions you've got in place to mitigate the likelihood of breach. At the top, you get a sense of the obligation, also the related alerts. So, regulatory change that is to a greater or lesser extent relevant to this particular obligation, and tools that contain data found on government websites, regulatory websites, occasionally content we've built ourselves that allows you to better action and respond to the information that's caught in this obligation. Now, the first field beneath the sub-obligations is the description, and this sets out what this obligation entails. In this instance, the organisation or agency must ensure that it only collects and handles personal information about an individual in accordance with the relevant privacy laws and so on. Now, the language we use is deliberate. When we say must, there's a formal legal requirement or some sort of mandatory code of practice that has a requirement on you to behave in a particular fashion. Where we use may or should, that's where good practice, guidelines, standards are used to inform the way that you manage the obligation. The next field, the compliance question, captures the obligation as a question. So in the event that you want to roll out attestation questions in future, you can use this obligation question to ask people who have carriage of this obligation how they're managing it. The next field is guidance. What this does is give you a sense of what this obligation requires of you as an organization. And because it's a core obligation, it covers a variety of different topics at a relatively high level. But you can see here there are references to tools. So for example, in this instance, WA doesn't have a specific legislative privacy regime for public sector agencies, but there are ombudsman guidelines to follow. Those are linked to up here in the tools section. Now, we'll go through the heads of topic, when personal information may be collected, dealing with unsolicited information in particular jurisdictions for particular kinds of entities, what methods of collection are available, how notification of collection looks like. Then we move on to the remedial action. Now, the remedial action field sets out what kind of operational controls our technical writers, our content developers, our legal experts, our industry experts consider will be useful to mitigate the likelihood of a breach or the effect of that breach should it occur. It's a great place to health check what you've already got in terms of policies and procedures and so on, and potentially build out your control library. The next field is the consequence field, and this will always capture the worst case scenario in the event that you're found to be in breach. And it's a good place to start assessing the risk impact of obligations that are relevant to you against your risk taxonomy. Finally, the compliance sources. This looks at all of the primary source material, often at the section level or the paragraph level, that our content team and our legal experts have considered relevant to this particular topic. So rather than simply saying, look at the Privacy Act, you can see section 6, 11, 13, and so on have all been considered as relevant to this particular topic. So when things change, either amending legislation affects existing legislation or new legislation is brought to bear, it'll be alerted on and caught within the related alerts field here. And then to the extent that we need to, we'll rewrite the obligation, update it to the new legislative requirements, and add those in this field here. Then definitions. Definitions are there because we understand that not everyone coming to compliance management necessarily has a legal background or a compliance background. So when we use terminology in our content that's defined in the legislation that we use to support it, we'll pull the definition out of the relevant definitions section and put it here. So when we say agency, it's as defined by Section 6 of the Privacy Act 1988. The last field to consider is the historical notes field. What this field does is capture all of the changes that we've made to an obligation over the course of its life. So there are a variety of different reasons why we might cause to change an obligation, and you can see a variety of them here. Back in 2024, they were updated as part of an ongoing compliance audit. Most recently, it was updated to add references to the Information Commissioner's privacy guidance on age assurance technologies, and a new tool has been added, and there was an alert that was sent out as well. PDP tells you it's a privacy and data protection alert. 406 tells you it's the 406th piece of regulatory change that we've caught that relates to this particular module. Now, the next field to look at is related alerts. And this gives you a sense of the variety of different kinds of content that we're tracking and alerting on. So, most recently, the Office of Information Commissioner put out an exposure draft in relation to children's online privacy. You can see that it's an FYI alert, so it's talking to prospective changes that may affect this particular obligation in the future. It's active, so it hasn't been superseded by another step in the process of regulatory reform, and this is when it was published. And you can see the variety of different things we track. There's a bill, for example, that counts as an FYI alert. There's updates in relation to COVID-19 information privacy, and a variety of different elements here. FYI alerts, as I mentioned, talk to prospective changes. Action required alerts talk to changes that you need to either make to the way that you manage a particular obligation or to changes to the obligation itself. And then finally, there's a third sort that we'll cover when we get to the alert section of this demonstration that captures all of the changes that we make to a module over the course of each month. Finally, tools. You can see here, this is the kind of content that will support the obligation with by way of tools. So links to the Information Commissioner's APPs, for example, their guidance around tax file numbers, a summary of the consequences of breaches, how to treat the management of personal information in WA, and so on. So again, guidance that will support you on your obligations journey. Now, that was one way of viewing the data. The register also gives you capacity to link directly to the related alerts and the tools that are pertinent to a given obligation. And it has a variety of editable fields that allow you to determine an obligation's compliance status. You can add a variety of different owners. You can look at a review date. You can add particular risk impacts, risk likelihoods, and you can link controls so that you can see which controls you have in place in your control library, or you can refer to them here and then save those changes. Now, it's also important to note those editable fields are also searchable and filterable. So if you wanted to have a look at all of the obligations where the risk impact was major, you could click there, click on major, and this will filter out anything that you haven't assigned as a major risk impact. Now, you'll see here there are flags associated with these two obligations. So what we might do is clear this. Flags allow you to determine which obligations within a given register are pertinent to you. Within any given register, you might find obligations that are directly on point, but likewise, you might find obligations that aren't relevant to you for a variety of different factors. By flagging an obligation, you can then say these obligations that we need to worry about, and the ones that we don't flag are the ones we don't. And then you can use a filter up here to just focus on the tracked obligations. Now, there are two more views when it comes to obligations, library and dashboard. The filters that you import there carry across to these different views. So you can see we've got 15 obligations with the given set of filters. And these are links to those obligations, and it gives you a sense of what's been updated in the last month. The third view is the dashboard view. And this allows you to see what's been active or archived, what's been added. You can see the percentage and the total of tracked obligations and the elements of which are not classified, compliant, partially compliant, and not compliant. And again, you can see which of these obligations have been assigned owners. Now, I mentioned that there were different ways to filter. So if we go back to our register view, you'll see on the left-hand side, there's a persistent menu that allows you to, once you've done your initial scope, to overlay additional filters. So we looked before that there were archived obligations in play. What we can do is just focus on the active ones. At the moment, I've got privacy and data protection as a filter, but if I wanted to add more particular obligations, I could use the module filter to expand that. And as you add new content, you'll be able to see what's in play here. You can also filter by jurisdiction. You can filter by business function. You can filter by compliance level requirement, whether it's mandatory, down to voluntary code of conduct, or internal policy. You can look at compliance topics, such as records management, licensing and registration, consumer protection. And then finally, you can filter by the penalties. So if you just want to focus on the obligations that contain serious risk impacts, you can use these filters to simply focus on those. So you can see that there's a wide variety of content, but also a wide variety of tools in the obligation registers that allow you to identify what's relevant, manage that relevance, and present your final work in a variety of different ways. The next thing to look at are alerts. Now, the obligations show you what you're required to do today. The alerts touch on what might be coming tomorrow. Now, as we saw before in the related alerts section, there are three different sorts of alerts. FYIs that talk to prospective changes, and required alerts that talk to changes that you might need to consider either by dint of reviewing policies or procedures or because the obligation itself has been rewritten by our content team, and the news alerts. And let's walk through each three of those now. This is an alert that was sent out that captures changes relating to the Surveillance Devices Amendment, Public Interest Exceptions Act 2026, guidance that it's achieved royal assent. As we saw before, PDP relates to privacy and data protection. 401 tells you it's the 401st piece of reg change. As this piece of legislation rolls through the milestones from second reading to potentially committee stage to achieving royal assent to taking effect or taking effect in a series of tranches, we'll issue a fresh alert. The most recent one will be active. The preceding ones will be archived, but it will keep the same alphanumeric code. So you can track the narrative arc of legislative reform from beginning all the way through to conclusion. Similar to the obligations, there are page anchors available on the left-hand side to navigate quickly between fields. And on the right-hand side, you can see what this module alert relates to, when it was published, and owners and risk levels. Now, in the content itself, the first thing you'll see is the impact rating. What this allows you to do is work out whether this change is something that will be mission critical, whether there's some moderate changes, or whether it's a minor administrative change. And you can drop a filter in place that will allow you to distinguish between those at a macro level. The next field shows you which obligations this particular regulatory reform may affect, and there are links to those. It gives you the effective date. Now, this is an FYI alert, so even though it's achieved royal assent, it hasn't yet taken effect, but that will be described in the following field that gives you a summary of what this regulatory reform is achieving. And then finally, at the bottom of every FYI and action required alert, there is a link to the primary source material and guidance around how to respond. So upon commencement, organizations will need to do the following things in order to comply with this amending legislation. You can also see at the bottom that this change looks at not just obligations within privacy and data protection, but other modules as well. Now, that's an FYI alert. This is an action required alert. Now, it has the same structure, page anchors on the left-hand side, the metadata on the right-hand side, and the editable fields, the impact rating, the related obligations. But what this does is set out the milestones, because this has now taken effect, or at least partially taking effect. It sets out the milestones of these particular amendments taking effect, so you can plan ahead to make sure that as each of these milestones lands, you're alive to the changes that are taking effect. Again, it gives you a summary of what this legislative reform is doing. It gives you links to the amending legislation. And then finally, it gives you a summary of what you need to do. And here you can see organizations must be aware that the Victorian Commissioner is a prescribed entity under restricting non-disclosure agreements from September this year. You'll need to be aware of changes to spent convictions and so on. Now, the third sort of alert is a news alert. So What this does is look at what we've done to the privacy and data protection module in the month of March. Again, looks at the impact rating, shows you which obligations were affected, when the changes took effect, and it gives you a summary of not just what changed, but why it changed. And then links to the primary source material that affected those changes as well. So you can see, using the alerts, you can stay on top of what's changed, what's changing, and then you can see a summary of what we've done to each of the modules in your subscription through that news alert. Now, as with obligations, there are some persistent filters on the left-hand side, and you can use these filters to refine and flow the content. So we could just focus on active alerts, we could just focus on action required alerts, we could look at particular modules, we can look at just the significant changes that took effect at the Commonwealth level and in New South Wales, for example. And again, you can overlay this with business function, compliance requirements, compliance topics, regulatory update type as well. So regulatory update is whether it tracks new legislation, whether there's a compliance deadline, or whether there's amendment or revisions coming our way. In addition to those filters, if you just want to look at date ranges, that's available to you here. So if you just wanted to look at all the changes that have been sent out over a given period, you can add that. And of course, as I touched on before, there are editable fields. So you can sort by effective date, but these allow you to assign an owner and a risk status to a given obligation. Now, as with obligations, again, there are other ways of viewing the content. Once you've put the filters in place, you can then have a look at the library view that allows you to see with the filters that you put in. There are 23 action requireds, 15 FYIs, no news alerts, and here are links to those particular obligation alerts. And then finally, the dashboard allows you to see summaries. So you can see of these, 23 are significant, and these provide you with snapshots of the alerts within the filters that you've set up, giving you a summary and some suggested action as well as effective dates. Now, a further feature available to you through alerts is creating an email notification. What this allows you to do is, if you'd like to be kept abreast of changes in particular areas of the organization, you can create an environment where you can nominate what kinds of alerts you want to receive as a digest. So again, if you wanted to just have a look at Commonwealth and New South Wales, you could add that filter in. We can drop out some of the UK, the EU, New Zealand, and so on as well. If you wanted to just look at action requireds, you can drop that in. You can filter by business function. You can filter by compliance topic, and filter by regulatory update type, and so on and so forth. And once you've settled on a set of filters, what you can do is create a space where when alerts are sent out, you can receive the digest either by email or just through the platform that we're looking at today. On a cadence that's appropriate to you, you can determine who gets these over what period of time and whether you want as HTML or when the alert is run, even if no updates occur. And then finally, you can review and save your settings. So this is a way of you setting up a space where you can be kept on top of changes without you having to come in to the alerts registers to see what's changing. Now, that's alerts and obligations. The next thing to consider is searching. So there are a variety of different ways that you can surface information using the search tools embedded within the platform. So if I were to search for something like breach notification, at the top level, I can do something as straightforward as drop a couple of filters in. I just want to see Australia, but I do want to see alerts and obligations. And then I'll hit search. And you can see the top left, we've got more than 10,000 results, which is a lot. But again, there are persistent filters here, so you can focus down to particular modules that might be relevant to you. You can look at particular jurisdictions, business functions, and so on. But this graphical display shows you that it's looked for instances across the dataset in your subscription where the word breach appears and where the word notification appears. There may be better ways to show that, so I'll show you how that looks in a second. While we're here, though, there are again 3 different views. This is the default. This is the graphical interface. You can change that view, the top right-hand corner, by seeing where those instances appear. And then thirdly, you can get a summary. So you get a quick view of what the search results have found, and also this you can see what has resulted in this being caught. So you can see this misses the word notification, but it does contain the word breach. Now, to edit our search down to something a little bit more reasonable, we can go up to here to edit the search. The default search is our natural language search, but if you want to start using Boolean factors, such as putting it in inverted commas to create a search for a phrase rather than individual words, I may have put too many filters in there. That's better. So now we've got 324 instances where the phrase breach notification appears. And you can see here, rather than having 2 different color codes, this is the same code because we're looking for this particular string rather than 2 different instances. To get a sense of all of the Boolean tools that are available to you, we go back to our landing page. You'll be able to see that there's an advanced search function that gives you capacity to access all of the different ways that the platform supports different searching. So at the landing page, you can see the advanced search functionality here under the magnifying glass. So what this does is gives you access to things like searching by the obligation ID of a given obligation, but it also links you to the terms and connectors. So this shows you some of the functionality, but to view them all, click on that link, and this will give you access to all of the different ways that you can finesse and refine a given search using terms like and or and not. You can look at proximity connectors, so before or with or near, or wildcards, such as characters that will allow you to, if you're not sure about the spelling, you can use, or you're not sure about whether the word has a particular suffix, you can use these. So for example, with the exclamation mark, if you did a search for breach with an exclamation mark, it would then provide you with results with not just breach, but breached, breaches, breaching, and so on. Now, the final part in all of this is Protege. Protege is a generative AI solution that is unique to LexisNexis. To access it, click on the Protege logo on the left-hand side, or of course it's available to you as a persistent menu link on the right-hand side throughout obligations, alerts, and searches. There are 4 aspects to what Protege can do for you. The first is ask a regulatory question. What this will do is allow you to insert a prompt that will surface the information that you're looking for and canvas obligations in our registers, alerts in our registers, and the underpinning legislation. It's important to note that Protege only looks at content from the LexisNexis universe and goes no further than that. So here, for example, you could ask, what are my obligations in relation to a given space, in a given time, in a given jurisdiction, in a given area of law, such as, here's one I prepared earlier. As a risk and compliance officer with a large charity operating in Victoria, what are our obligations with regard to managing psychosocial hazards? And here is the response I got from that prompt. Runs you through the underpinning legislation, and it looks at what you're required to do in order to comply with the legislation in the Victorian environment, which I should note is distinct from the broader harmonised legislation. Now, The next element of Protege looks purely at regulatory change. So instead of looking at the legislation, obligations, and alerts, it just focuses on alerts. And again, I've done a search here. These are some example questions, but when I looked at this a couple of days ago, I posed the question as a risk and compliance officer at a large charity in Victoria, what regulatory change in the psychosocial hazard space has occurred recently, and what is coming up? Having interrogated that, it comes back, it says it's looked at 20 different alerts and runs me through what the recent changes are that have taken effect, points me to what's happened in terms of WorkSafe Victoria's compliance code and the key features of that, and then flags upcoming changes, as well as recommended actions for compliance, immediate actions, priority actions, and ongoing actions as well. The third element is uploading. Now, what I've prepared here is a summary of a 112-page WorkSafe Victoria document around psychosocial hazards. So, what I've uploaded is a 112-page document. Then I asked it to provide me with a summary of the document highlighting key themes and takeaways. And here are the key themes and takeaways. So again, it's designed to review content, pass through that, and respond to your questions to make your job of managing often quite extensive and complicated pieces of regulation and turn it into something that's a whole lot more manageable. So again, it runs you through the risk management process, psychosocial hazards and examples of same, workplace investigations, what the appendices contain, and then the key takeaways on how to respond. Now, the fourth and final element of all of this is draft. Now, what draft does is, I think, phenomenal because it allows you, at the conclusion of what you've done in these three spaces, to then generate some content that's unique to you. So the scenario that I looked at before, I uploaded a comprehensive document about psychosocial hazards in the workplace in Victoria. I looked at what my obligations were. I looked at what reg change had occurred and what was coming in case I'd missed something. And then one of the things that the key takeaways that I got from when I uploaded the document, supported by the obligations that were highlighted here, was we'll need a policy. So I went to generate a draft, and then I prompted Protege to, as a risk and compliance officer of a large charity in Victoria, please draft a policy around the requirements of managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. And this is what it's come up with. It's given me a policy. It's given me the opportunity to insert the name and the date of the organization and when it was started. It sets out the purpose, scope, the definitions, and again, supported by primary source material from LexisNexis content that gives you some recourse to go back and check why it's come up with the answers that it has. Then the legislative framework, the principles and objectives, roles and responsibilities, and so on. This took me about 3 minutes to prompt and then generate, which, as you can imagine, is considerably faster than it would have taken me otherwise. Protege goes a long way to supporting the establishment of a strong, resilient, and flexible compliance management strategy, together with the content that's caught in the compliance platform itself. I think we can safely say that the RegCompliance Plus platform is something that should not only allow you to work through what your obligations are, identify them, share the responsibility for managing them with your colleagues, track reg change, and then build out the library of content that you need as an organization to support the ongoing management of that. I hope today's been useful. If you have any questions, please reach out to LexisNexis.